And you all can hear me okay, can't you?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you to those who are already jumping on with us. We are going to get started in just about 30 seconds as we let individuals join today's webinar. Okay, well, it looks like we have a good amount of attendees already on with us, so we are going to get started. Welcome to today's Environment and Energy Leader webinar sponsored by Montrose Environmental Group in partnership with Sensible EDP and Bracewell. Welcome to Measurement-Informed Methane Inventories in today's regulatory environment. Before we dive into today's content, just a few reminders for all attendees. This event will be available on demand later today, so you will have the chance to go back and watch this again. Montrose will be providing a copy of the slide deck to all attendees after the live event in a follow-up email. If you have questions for our panelists today, please submit using the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. We will do our very best to get to all of the questions before the webinar ends, but if we do not get a chance to answer your question, a member of the team will follow up with you as soon as possible. Feel free to join the chat, tell us where you're calling in from. We really do have a global audience with us on today. And there will be a few poll questions for attendees, so we appreciate your participation in all of our polls. And at this point, I am going to turn the event over to Elizabeth McGurk. And again, if you have questions for the panelists, please feel free to submit them at any point during today's presentation. So, Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you everyone for attending. We're really excited to talk to you today about a very important and timely topic, measurement-informed methane inventories in today's regulatory environment. Here's a rundown of how we're going to structure today's event. I'm going to start off by giving a brief introduction to Montrose Environmental in case you don't already know us, an overview of the fine folks who will be participating in the roundtable discussion today, and then move into providing a little bit of background information and context for our roundtable. I'm going to talk to how the methane regulatory landscape is looking right now, what's changed recently, what's coming down the pipe, and how does it come together and influence what you're doing to put together an accurate emissions inventory. From that point, we're going to move into the roundtable discussion phase of our programming, and participants from Montrose Environmental teams, as well as partner from Bracewell LLP will be participating in that discussion. So to start, Montrose, some of you may know us already and some of you may not. We are a full-service environmental firm with locations all over the United States and Canada, as well as locations in Australia and Europe. We first built our reputation in the emissions measurement and emissions detection space with our world-class stack testing teams, our LDAR teams, and our OGI teams. Since then, however, we've expanded significantly and grown our expertise in a lot of different areas that we feel are absolutely critical to putting together an integrated and comprehensive methane program. We have folks who are experts in measurement, folks who know methane mitigation initiatives, others who specialize in taking that data, using it, visualizing it, and using it to inform decisions. We also have people who are experts in the permitting and compliance space and who can support community engagement and support. All of these come together and influence each other and can form the basis of a company's methane story. With that in mind, our panel includes today people who have expertise in a lot of different, very relevant service areas. My name is Elizabeth McGurk. I sit in Austin, Texas. My background is in air quality permitting and compliance, and I currently sit on Montrose's Sustainability and Climate Advisory team. Joining me on the roundtable will be Jenna Granstra, who is the Director of Gulf Coast Operations for Sensible EDP. And is an expert in sensor technology. Josh Anholt, who is our Vice President of Technology, is an expert in emissions detection and measurement, as well as measurement technologies. Whit Swift is a partner with Bracewell and has built his career in the environmental law arena and specializes in regulatory compliance. And then finally, Steve Davis will be moderating our discussion, and Steve is the SVP of Environmental Solutions, also a Sensible EDP. All right, so first, setting the stage, what does the current landscape look like when we're looking at methane? So specifically looking at the United States, we've had 4 very big pieces of proposed and finalized regulations come together and be promulgated recently. And together, they overlap to provide a framework that is proposed to dictate the United States' first ever methane tax or methane fee. They include provisions that tell you when you need to take direct measurements of your emission sources and when you can, and also include information on how do you do this? How do you monitor, and how do you measure? One anticipated piece of United States rulemaking that we're not going to get into today, I'm just going to mention briefly here, is the anticipated PHMSA rulemaking that is very specific to the pipeline infrastructure. All right, so I mentioned that these 4 rules overlap and they come together and form this story. I think it's important to understand how they influence each other and how they interplay now and how they're proposed to interplay moving forward. First up was the Inflation Reduction Act. As part of the IRA, it included very specific provisions to Congress to establish rules that did 3 very specific things. 1, institute new emission standards for the oil and gas industry. This is done through the NSPS subparts Quad OB and Quad OC. 2, increase the accuracy of reported emissions inventories. What are companies emitting and how do they report it? This is done through the proposed revisions to the mandatory reporting rule, specifically subpart W, which applies to oil and gas services. And 3, establish a methane tax, which is being implemented through the proposed methane waste emissions charge, or WEC. So first, IRA, it says, Congress, you need to do these 3 things. And so they did. First off the press, the NSPS subpart Quad OB, Quad OC series. These are emission standards for new and modified oil and gas sources, as well as emission standards for existing stationary sources, again, in the oil and gas space. Next, the mandatory reporting rule, subpart W. This is the rule that dictates how a company is going to calculate and report its greenhouse gas footprint. The proposed rule includes more provisions for measurement-based inventories and includes previously unreported emission sources in an effort to arrive at a more accurate inventory. And then finally, the WEC, which was proposed earlier this year, which is the methane waste emissions charge that's based on the annual emissions that exceed a specific allowance for a facility or an asset. NSPS subpart Quad OB and Quad OC influences the WEC because at some point there will be a regulatory compliance exemption from WEC applicability if a facility is in full compliance with the NSPS subparts. Subpart W, that influences the WEC too. And this is because the emissions that a facility reports under subpart W will be used to determine the financial liability under the WEC. So if your head isn't spinning yet, it probably should be. Everything is changing and it's changing fast, and it's hard to keep track of what happens when. This slide will be included in the deck that's available following our discussion today, but it gives a little bit of an overview of the 5-year outlook of what the regulatory space is expected to look like in the United States from when rules are proposed, expected to be finalized, and become effective. I think just some important things to call out here is that we're expecting the NSPS subpart Quad-O series to be published this week, which means the compliance dates will start ticking here in about 60 days. And the Quad-O-C series will be effective in about 3 years. We expect the greenhouse gas reporting program rule to come out later this summer. And as proposed now, the WEC will apply to emissions you are generating now with your first charge due in March 2025. All right, and that's just what's going on at a federal level in the United States. I also want to briefly call out that things are changing other places too, both on a state level and internationally. In the United States, we're seeing states start to move on their own, making changes that apply to operations within their state. Colorado, Reg 7 will require GHG verification beginning in 2025, so an independent verification of a represented inventory. California has passed regulations for orphaned wells to prevent the creation of new orphaned wells, and also has got a lot of attention for its 2 new climate disclosure bills. Canada has instituted a national emissions cap and trade system in the oil and gas sector, and has also proposed its own suite of regulations to reduce emissions from oil and gas operations. Europe has proposed a methane emissions reduction strategy that will be highly based on the oil and gas methane partnership framework, and has also implemented CBAM, or the carbon border adjustment mechanism that applies to specific industries, including those in the energy space. And then finally, at a truly global scale, out of COP28 came the creation of the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, which was an initiative where global companies signed on and committed to a 0.2% methane intensity by 2030 and net zero emissions in the scope 1 and 2 space by 2050, as well as the elimination of all routine flaring. So there's a lot going on right now. I want to do a slightly deeper dive into the 3 recent pieces of United States rulemaking, because those are going to really form the backbone of our roundtable discussion. I want to talk about these specifically from a measurement-based emissions inventory approach. What do these rules have to say about how you put together a comprehensive measurement program to really drive at an accurate emissions inventory? So first, NSPS subparts Quad-O-B and Quad-O-C. These are the emission standards for stationary sources in the oil and gas space. The deadlines, or the effective dates rather, are summarized on the right-hand side of this slide. NSPS subpart Quad-O-B, those apply to new and modified sources that are either newly constructed, modified, or reconstructed after December 2022. The rule will become effective in 2024. Again, that anticipated publication date is this week, putting the initial compliance dates just over 2 months from now. NSPS subpart Quad-O-C is the rule that applies to existing sources that were constructed, reconstruction, or modified prior to that December 2022 date. That one is expected to become effective in 2027 with full compliance required by 2029. It should be noted that this NSPS subpart Quad-O-C is interesting in that it's not specific guidelines. It's basically the directive to states to develop their own programs that implement the same level of control as NSPS Quad-O-B. All right, so what's in these things? 2 specific items that I want to call out are the monitoring provisions. There are enhanced monitoring provisions that apply to different sectors in the oil and gas industry. So these enhanced monitoring provisions include things like more frequent LDAR surveys or OGI surveys. They also allow you to implement continuous monitoring options, either in lieu of or in addition to more traditional LDAR or OGI-based programs. They require flare and combustion device performance monitoring to establish that sites are actually achieving complete combustion. And they include alternative technology approval provisions for things like aerial monitoring, et cetera, to give room for the development of emerging technologies and give companies the option of implementing technologies that may not exist now. One thing that is completely novel about NSPS Subpart Quad OB is that it establishes for the first time what is called the super emitter program. Under this super emitter program, approved third parties have the ability to spot and report emission events to the United States EPA. The United States EPA will take these reports, validate them, and then notify the operator who caused the emission event. The rule contains then very specific provisions for the response to such a report, including the response is going to need to include things like a root cause analysis and corrective action planning, and information about what happened and what caused this event that this third party spotted. This is new, it hasn't been done before here. All right, subpart W, this is the reporting rule. So this is the rule that is telling companies how to calculate their emissions inventory and how to report it to the United States EPA. So this rule has been proposed. The EPA is no longer accepting comments upon it. In the final rulemaking, it is expected sometime this summer. It has to be issued by August, according to the deadlines in the Inflation Reduction Act. What's interesting about this one is, I mean, it's all emissions inventory, right? So it's all relevant to today's discussion. But what's the material changes are and where folks are likely to see an impact to what inventory has been reported previously is that there are new emission sources that are required to be reported now. The current version of the reporting rule does not require emissions of all of these sources that are listed on the left-hand side of these screens. They just didn't have to be calculated before. The rule as it's written now also allows some provisions for using measurements to inform the reported inventory, specifically for acid gas removal, for blowdowns, and also for compressor vents for some industry segments. The new rule is expected to allow additional monitoring and measurement so that you can use actual empirical data to influence your numbers that you report to the agency. You're anticipated to be able to use direct measurement for pneumatic devices and pumps, associated natural gas compressor vents, equipment leaks, and other large release events, which points back to the NSPS Quad OB super emitters. All right, and then the third rule, the WEC, this is the United States first methane tax. This is specifically going to apply to facilities who report more than 25,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent under subpart W of the mandatory reporting rule. The fee will be based on the difference between actual emissions and an allowance. The allowance is based on the industry segment of the facility and the throughput through that facility, where facility matches the definition as given in subpart W. It will allow netting across assets and basins to determine that financial liability. The charges per ton are set to increase with $900 per metric ton beginning in reporting year 2024, which, as I mentioned previously, is now increasing up to $1,500 per metric ton in 2026. What's interesting here, reporting year 2024, that's before the mandatory reporting rule is released. So that's going to be calculated according to those previously promulgated rules. There will be exemptions for the WEC that will allow a facility to become exempt from having to pay anything under the WEC. There are exemptions related to plugged wells and some about permitting timeline, but one that I think is really interesting is that there is an exemption related to complete compliance with NSPS subparts Quad OB and Quad OC. That won't be available for 3 years though, because if you remember right, the NSPS Quad OC timeline, the earliest it will be implemented is 2027. So we're not looking for that exemption to become available for quite some time. But really what our takeaways here for me is that one, using emission factor based emissions inventories aren't going to give an asset or an operator the power or the information to drive down their emissions, because it won't give an accurate picture of what's happening where. And so that won't give you an avenue to really reduce your financial liability under this rule. Measurement informed inventories are going to be more accurate and give you an opportunity for targeted methane mitigation efforts. Okay, before we move into our panel, I just included one more bonus slide because I think it's important to recognize that there are voluntary programs in addition to regulatory ones that are available for the oil and gas industry. And a lot of those programs are very measurement based. Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0 in particular is a program that I have a lot of experience with. And it is a program that's built around having a measurement inventory driven approach to methane intensity reductions. So this is a framework that's telling you how to take source level emissions measurements and site level emissions measurements and use that data to put together a robust inventory and use that information to inform your reduction efforts. There are a lot of parallels between programs like this one and the proposed or that suite of rulemaking that we've talked about. And so I think it's important to put them side by side and think about how a program like this might become attractive to your operations when you're looking at updating them anyway for our new regulatory requirements. All right, with that, I'm going to hand this over to Steve Davis, who will be moderating our roundtable discussion.
Excellent. Thanks, Elizabeth. Appreciate that very much. To kick off the roundtable, I had a question for Josh. Josh, how do you start developing a measurement-informed emissions inventory? What do you feel like? What's easy, what's not, and what are your clients doing today?
This may sound really simple. And by the way, thank you to all for joining globally, seeing in the chat, some great countries popping up. Understand what you own and where you own it. A $900 level controller was whenever in your inventory is now in your inventory. This may seem rudimentary in saying, but in practice is actually can be proved hard. And second, Excel is not a database. The advancements of inventory management, because that's what we're talking about, is source level measurement. And the source level is based on a very enhanced inventory of what you own, where you own, and the rocks that you're producing from and the associated equipment. And it's from there that you can understand how you can get a round peg and a round hole, as opposed to a square peg round hole measure approach to those equipment types. Then you can start looking at the various technologies on a continuous or temporal basis of now building up how you, what the emission footprint is of a component, a process, a site, and at a basin level.
That makes sense, Josh. And you know, to further that, there's always the data play as well, right? We're trying to capture the data. Jenna, I know you're the director of field operations. You're in the field. How do you utilize the data you actually capture in the field? And are there challenges in acquiring that data? And maybe what are some solutions to overcome those challenges that you may see?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, one of the major challenges in this space is that there's several different technologies that you can deploy. As Josh mentioned, you can have surface level point sensors, there's lasers, aircrafts, drones, and the OGI camera. So you're working with a number of different vendors and different technology types. And it's important to understand the data that you're collecting, the accuracy, the sampling rates, detection limits, and then you have to store, interpret, and visualize the data from those various different sites. So one thing is important to overcome some of these challenges is to work with a partner and have a solid data management platform where you can store, interpret, and visualize all of your data and have a one-stop shop so that you don't have to go to the various different locations to try and understand what's going on at the site level.
Yeah, that also makes a lot of sense, Jenna. Take a different approach here. Whit, I have a question from more the legal aspect. The super emitter program got a lot of attention when EPA proposed and adopted the changes to the oil and gas methane rule. What does the lawyer think about that?
Yeah, it certainly is an interesting program, this concept of deputizing third parties to gather the information on which EPA will be making regulatory and enforcement decisions. It will undoubtedly be a focus of the legal challenges of the methane rule. And it's an interesting stretch of EPA's information gathering authority under Clean Air Act Section 114. That's certainly an interesting part, at least from the regulated community's potential challenges to the rules and concern about the rule. I think as a member of the regulated community, I look at it and think about, okay, we need to get a program in place to deal with this rule. Elizabeth mentioned, there are triggers for doing a root cause analysis, just identifying what might be the source of the high level short-term emissions that were identified, and also then preparing a report and getting it back to EPA. So I think there's a procedural aspect to it, as a company having the structure in place to deal with a super emitter notification that you receive. But I think also, tying really into what we're talking about here, it's an example of how better information will put you in a better position under this new regulatory regime. You've got a third party using, remote sensing technology that is convinced EPA that you either had or have a very high intensity methane release coming from your operations. The more you know about, the better monitoring you have of your site, the more you know about what's going on there, you're going to be much better equipped to deal with that, to conduct the required root cause investigation, but then also to push back. If indeed they were looking at, maybe it's somebody else's piece of equipment that had those emissions, or maybe those are authorized emissions. There are various things, but it certainly is one of the examples of where better information is going to put you in better posture under this new regulatory regime.
Yeah, and speaking of monitoring, the rules embrace alternative leak monitoring methods. Do you see any potential hangups or legal concerns there?
I guess certainly a legal or a hang-up more than a legal concern, I would say, in that I love the idea of, and Elizabeth was talking about this, about moving towards better data based on site-specific things as opposed to emission factors. And it's a great concept to allow an alternate method for measuring emissions or finding leaks that may be more accurate, more appropriate for a particular site. I think what I'm really interested to see is the program living up to the promise. And part of that, in my view, from dealing with clients with alternate test method requests and things like that, is the approval process for those methods. They embrace this use of alternate methods, but also there's a built-in process, understandably, for demonstrating that your alternate method is going to be as accurate as the method required by rule. And that can certainly be a hang-up and a block to getting things done. So I hope that EPA has the resources and capability to set up a program to make that happen, to thoroughly review and have the right resources to review those applications and approve them where they're merited. Because I think that the approval process could basically really hurt the value of that program. So I'd like to see that. And I think the other thing in thinking about the program is it also throws in kind of a regulatory advocacy piece to this, as far as not only do you need to have the technology, a good technology, but you've also got to have the folks behind that technology that can help work the system and get it through and get the EPA approval for it. So you want to, if you've just got the method, but you want to have somebody who also can explain that, can advocate for it, can get it through and get it EPA approved so you can take advantage of it.
Wait, that's super helpful. At this point, I wanted to throw up our first poll question to the attendees. If we can get that up on the screen and everyone could answer it, that would be fantastic. And just pretty simply, well, where do you sit in your organization? If we take a minute to answer that, we will show the poll results soon. All right, while people are answering the poll question one, Whit, you brought up data and alternative, methods and monitoring. Jenna, it kind of comes back to what we talked a little bit about before with data. Can you talk about the different applications of source level measurement compared to fixed base sensors?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. It's important to understand that each technology comes with a set of pros and cons, including accuracy, data frequency, how many you'll have to deploy at each site. I will say there's no one size fits all solution across the board. Each site has different needs based on the location, where it's located, staff, how soon people can get to the site. There's important questions to ask yourself, such as, what is best for this site? How often do you want or need to receive data? Are you going to respond to alerts? Who will be responding to alerts, and how quickly will you respond? So those are some of the things that you would consider before even deploying fixed or source level sensors in the field.
Yeah, and Josh, when you think about the source level measurement, what will be most helpful in the context of the super emitter provisions within Quad OB?
Having a corporate practice in place that allows personnel to put a finger on the problem based on data. So when you think of fence line monitoring sensors, they do a very good job of monitoring a facility, fence line, and then localizing to an area. Same with aircraft, or same with camera-based solutions on the market, or drones. They can localize to the area. It is now having the personnel who are methane literate to understand what the potential source for release is. Is it an overpressurized storage tank because the VRU is not at set point, or the vertical retention tower is misoperating, or a combustor wasn't burning, or someone closed a ball valve? Because it's understanding those sources that allows you to then prevent. As you monitor, you put the finger, you prevent. Now, if someone flies over, then you can at least understand why. Okay, they localized to this area, what was going on, because now we're getting into root cause analysis. And when we look at minimizing a tax payment, that being both the carrot and the stick in the equation, it's what can our engineers do? What can the mechanic with the wrench do to eliminate that source, to prevent it from happening again? And this is where I start looking at the more legacy equipment. I don't think we have necessarily a new problem. Engineering design standards, newer technologies, site designs, they're doing a very good job of creating Tupperware-based sites. But the older sites are based on old design standards. I think I like to give an analogy, like once upon a time, we smoked on airplanes. Once upon a time, we didn't wear seat belts in cars. Once upon a time, we didn't control storage tanks, or we had fuel gas driven pneumatics or chemical injection pumps. So it's now understanding that we don't smoke on airplanes anymore. Well, most places, or we should be wearing our seat belts in a vehicle. And so this is what's coming is to fruition, is now again coming back to what do you own and where you own it, and what is it going to do. And I think now we're getting into kind of like speaking about performance. No longer a definition of leak or a definition of vent, but total site-wide performance. And site-wide performance is based on the engineering design standard and how that equipment is operated. And it's through those elements that we can achieve the emission reductions and low methane intensities, and also have an understanding if, yes, the third party does fly over or drive by and says I'm emitting, you say, yes, I know. And I know the legal boundaries from which that gas emitted from. And I'm already 10 steps ahead of you on this front. And we've already got a management of change process in place to resolve or eliminate this emission source from our sites.
Yeah, I'll definitely agree that I don't miss smoking on planes. So, you bring up all these, the different potential technologies. Elizabeth, I know you're talking to a lot of different customers, whether it's US, Canada, or abroad. How do you evaluate the different technologies when there are so many on the market? And what are the challenges and opportunities with deploying more than one type of technology?
Sure, that's a really great question, Steve. I think that the first question that you need to ask yourself is why. What are you intending to do with this technology? Because as Jenna mentioned, there's very much pros and cons with different technologies. Some are great for detection, some are wonderful for quantification, some have really, really small margins of error and are very, very expensive. There's a lot of pros and cons in this space. You need to decide how are you going to use it and what information are you really, really looking for. The second question that I would want to look at to inform that decision is, okay, we've defined what, why. Is this a regulatory program? If it's regulatory, take a look and see, is it allowed under the current rule as it's written? Are you going to have to go through that process like Whit was talking about in terms of getting an alternative technology approved to meet the rule regulations? I think that that's really important too. And then you get into really the nuts and bolts of just looking at a technology itself. How accurate is it? Has it been verified by a third party? What does the literature look like for sources that are like your sources in evaluating this? In terms of challenges or opportunities in deploying more than one, I definitely have worked with clients who've chosen to deploy technology trials, right? You want to kind of try on a tech for size to see if it actually works for your operation and your locations before maybe committing to a fuller scale implementation. And I think that's a great way to get some information before going all in. I think Jenna can probably speak to this better than I can, but there are also going to be challenges though if you have a lot of different programs from an expertise point of view and making sure you understand all of the different things you're deploying, but then also from a data management perspective so that you can really use those different systems together to understand what's going on and get an apples to apples comparison if you're trying more than one thing at one time.
Yeah, Jenna, from your standpoint, again, being in the field, what challenges do you see with actually deploying the technology at your customer sites?
Yeah, so you're deploying multiple different technologies. You have different people responding. You have to have a good workflow on, we deploy these technologies. How are we going to respond? What are we doing with the data on a day-to-day basis? Who's looking at the data? Will a consultant go out and verify it? Or are we going to go out and verify it? There's a lot of different questions to be answered once you deploy the technology. And again, just understanding the accuracy, the sampling frequency, how we compare them, and then where do we store all this data? How do we handle all of it? You're producing so much data, but how do we interpret it and how do we look at it? So just making sure you have a platform that you can look at all the data for each of your sites and make it as easy as possible to do the interpretation and visualization so you can respond and make sure you're ahead of those the super emitters, if you're a super emitter, being proactive in that regard. So.
Yeah, that's great, Jenna. So let's take a break right here and then do poll question number 2. If we can post that, please. I'm not sure if that got posted or not. There it is. Has your company already started a methane monitoring pilot or project? Pretty simple, yes or no question. We'll keep that poll question up for a bit as we jump back into the roundtable. Another question for Elizabeth. Regulatory changes are one driver for emissions management. How do you voluntary reduction programs like OGMP, how do they fit in as well?
Good question. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the voluntary programs follow an approach that is essentially put together in inventory using measurement, like source level measurement of a particular equipment type. Verify that inventory, that make sure that you understand it, you've captured everything with site level measurements. And then you use that information to inform your mitigation efforts, to actually put together a cost benefit analysis of implementing new technology or a new approach to reduce your emissions footprint. This basic approach should sound pretty familiar. It kind of mirrors the regulations that we've been talking about already, right? Where you've got the requirement to measure emissions from your different sources to report them under, say, subpart W. You've got options to do continuous monitoring or site level analyses under Quad OB, which can kind of mirror that level 5, that site level approach, and then ideally use that information to drive down your emissions to reduce your fee under the WEC. That it's very similar. The regulations are starting to drive requirements closer to what's required under these voluntary programs. And so I think that it's time to look and see whether there are enough benefits of the voluntary programs to consider signing on, because a lot of the things that they require are now being required in the regulatory space as well. And some of those benefits of the voluntary programs are things like having the name recognition of being a company who's chosen to do more and say publicly that they're committed to reducing their methane footprint, or joining a community of like-minded companies because they often have a very strong consortium to discuss the complicated engineering and mitigation challenges that are common across the industry. And then finally, the last thing I'm going to say is that the US rulemaking, I say it kind of mirrors OGMP, but the upcoming EU regulations are directly built upon OGMP requirements. So those ones are saying, we really like this OGMP framework, and we're going to start requiring it for companies that operate here, maybe companies that export here, and are really just requiring people to do it.
Yeah, Josh, I know I keep going back to you because of your breadth of experience with so many different clients. Anything from your point of view on either OGMP or any of the voluntary reduction programs?
Yeah, I think it's starting with the starting point of what you want to be when you grow up, and how you play within the geopolitical space. And I think going back to Elizabeth's comment about European Union OGMP, that's cross-border tax adjustments. I think of exports leaving the Gulf of Mexico and an LNG shipment hitting the port in the Netherlands, and that natural gas being distributed across Europe. There will be a tax applied to molecules that are less green than others. So getting a consistent yardstick on a measurement approach within your operations. And if you're going to do something, set to a level that is to that what you want to be to grow up. But if the set the level is minimum compliance, that's all right. But when I look where the world is going, we're not stopping at a 45% reduction, 55% reduction, 75% reduction. We're achieving a 0.02% of the total supply chain will be allowed to emit to atmosphere. It is in that basis that the natural gas can compete on a global basis with coal. It can compete on a global basis as a low carbon intensity energy source. So those that have a long vision like I do, that oil and gas is here to stay because it lifts people in countries out of poverty. It provides energy to create wealth and opportunities around the world. And it's not necessarily about climate change. It's about creating energy, and the best energy. And if we're going to produce the best energy, it might as well be coming from the best countries in the world, the United States of America and Canada. so that we can truly stand behind and say that we are providing the best for society and mankind ahead. And it's that belief that I think that we can rise to the occasion. We have the engineers, we have the technologies, we have the materials, we have the financial instruments. Pick a yardstick, start measuring with it. Your yardstick might change. You might go from imperial to metric, or back to imperial, but pick a yardstick and start measuring. And then from there, that will feed the shareholders, that will feed the board of directors, that will be your social license to operate. And that is how you put your head on your pillow at night, knowing that, damn, I'm doing a good job for myself, for my country, for my state, for my province, and for the world. And is it in that belief that we can do this and we have the tools. So that's where my mind goes when I think about OGMP and I think about this, is that we can.
Yeah, I love that, Josh. I appreciate that. Let's do our last poll question, if we can post that. And someone from the audience said Josh 100% agree. So I think that touched a nerve, Josh. Last question. Does your company intend to implement a certification program like OGMP or MIQ in the next 12 months? And I would appreciate all of the attendees answering that. And we're going to move into a bit of the Q&A before we wrap up with thoughts and perspectives from the panelists. I think what I'll do is I'll read these off, and for the panelists, I'll assign questions to answer and put you on the spot. So I'll start with you, Elizabeth, from Carolyn. For the WEC, the WEC, is the 25,000 carbon dioxide equivalents for methane emissions only?
No, it is total carbon dioxide equivalent emissions reported under subpart W, and Whit's nodding, so I'm glad I got it right. So that's from CO2, NO2, all pollutants that were reported under the mandatory reporting rule feed into that CO2e calculation.
Excellent. All right. Thank you.
Charge just applies to your methane, but
Yes,
the threshold of applicability is based on CO2e.
Got it. Thank you, Whit. Next question is from Pedro. Are we only talking about linear installations and specific locations, or does this legislation and measurement methods also apply to water reservoirs? I don't even know who to assign that to, so I'll just throw it to Josh.
Methane is methane. CH4 is CH4. The molecule is identical. Maybe the difference between anthropogenic and biogenic, maybe with some ethane background tracers within there. But suffice to say that, yes, landfills or any other kind of sources of methane are of consideration. And it's not just the oil and gas sector that is being talked about. In Canada, landfills are in proposed gazette for measuring and monitoring. So now we're looking at drone-based top-down Gaussian flux rate measurement tools and lasers, tailing ponds from SAGD operations. Methane is methane. There might be some sectors in some countries, agricultural and other aspects, or like food waste, or things like that, that will be emerging and coming on. But when you look on a dollar per ton basis, of course, it comes back to the oil and gas industries and heavy sectors of the world, which there are, revenues associated and marginal abatement cost curves that have a reasonable dollar per ton basis for tackling. But yes, as a society, we are looking at other sources of methane.
yeah, and I think from a regulatory basis, the rules we talked about today are specific to the oil and gas industry. But one thing that we've seen about the EPA is that if they kind of figure out an approach that they like for regulating one industry, you sometimes see something analogous come to the next industry down the pipe. Like, for instance, if you look at like the Refinery Act, you see some very, very similar requirements. And now the new proposed like chemical sources max, like they start them in one industry and then they apply them throughout.
All right. Thank you, Josh and Elizabeth. question from Jim, and we get this question a lot, especially the timing of it. Whit, I'm going to throw it your way, a non-Montrose answer from a kind of general perspective. From Jim, how do you view U.S. election results impact on EPA final rule on the IRA? What could change and how?
Yeah, sure. These rules certainly face a rocky road, and that's a good point, that it's not only the inevitable legal challenges, court challenges of the rules, but also potential political headwinds. I mean, we've seen, the last round of methane, oil and gas rules from the Obama administration were then rescinded. The methane specific part of it rescinded, and now we're back. So there is no doubt that these rules will face, legal challenges. They haven't, the reason why you're not reading about legal challenges to the methane rule so far is because the clock hasn't even started yet for when people can sue. But no doubt they will. States and certain groups are going to line up as soon as the rule actually becomes effective and it becomes timely to file suit. I think the most interesting thing, and the thing to remember, talking about this entire suite of rules when it comes to both political headwinds and also, court challenges, legal headwinds, is that these rules, different from the 2017 methane rule and different from, frankly, things like the Good Neighbor Plan and others, is there's law behind this. The Inflation Reduction Act was Congress telling EPA to do all of this stuff that we're talking about. Right now, they didn't give specific details on a lot of it. All of it is implementing rules. But, a real challenge that EPA has, particularly with our current Supreme Court and the scrutiny of agency decisions and less deference, frankly, being given to an agency like EPA. Here, you don't have that base position that EPA is getting out of its lane to take these steps. No, the Congress established the waste emissions charge program, the amounts, the deadlines, the compliance exemption. These things are established in law. So what you have here, compared to some other recent regulatory actions, you do have a better statutory basis for what EPA is doing here. That certainly doesn't mean that they're going to be immune to legal challenges, and there'll be things that get attacked. But yeah, I think looking ahead, the presidential election this year is without a doubt going to have an impact on these rules, and whether we see them kind of like some of these political footballs that bounce back and forth between administrations. And regardless of the election, we'll have, legal challenges. But I think the thing to remember here is these rules are situated a bit differently as far as their potential durability, in my view, because of the Inflation Reduction Act being the driver for all of this stuff.
That's great. I appreciate that. Yeah, that's a very popular question with 10 months to go, or what we have left here, and just getting past Super Tuesday. So we will all follow that, I'm sure, very closely. Jen, a question for you on sensor technology. The question is, how do you recommend companies adopting sensors and other real data this year accurately compared to the years previously when the technology was not used? Basically, what is the best way to go back and re-baseline so we can be sure we are accurately calculating over reductions?
Yeah, I think I'll also ask Elizabeth and Josh for their perspective, but I think until you start measuring and start collecting data on a routine basis and, get 6 months to a year's worth of data, without that, we have nothing to compare to. So we need, the seasonal variation, more time as well. Like, we need to see all of the operations to get a full picture of what's going on at the site level before we can even consider going back and rebaselining. But I think it's really important just to start collecting data as soon as possible to understand today. And then after you have a good chunk of data, then you can look at ways to go back and see what was going on. Josh, what are your thoughts there too?
Yeah, I think there's new baselines. We look at what new sources coming in. We look at the pneumatics. We look at other things that are like, now we're looking at point source measurements and the way we're doing it, we're going to recalculate the true area under the curve. In the past, if we were using a single point in time of volume and time and a single point, the area under the curve is a rectangle. But in reality, it's up and down. It's a Monday, it's a Tuesday, it's positive gas prices, negative gas prices, Trump, Biden, up, down, left, right. And so, yes, we will have a new baseline. And I've heard from producers, there's always been two sets of books. There's been those that subpart W says this is how you calculate, and here's actual. And this is where these new regulations and the OGMP voluntary standards, it's pushing those together. So a past base emission factor A times B equals C now to a point source. Yes. And you know what's going to happen? Some sites are going to go up, some sites are going to go down. But the universal truth will still hold true. There'll still be the fat tail distribution problem where 20% of the assets or 20% of the process or 20% of the equipment accounts for 80% of total emissions. It just seems to like ring true over and over and over again. And I think companies and people need to we need to call a ceasefire on like baselines. They're like, hey, we're recalculating because now we have the tools, the regulations and laws in our place that are allowing for actual. And it's from that actual then we find our true deltas. And then that's where, strong capitalistic forces will come into play about rate of returns, marginal limit cost curves, CapEx and OpEx spending on how we then laser focus financial dollars and financial tools and approaches onto those specific problems.
Thank you, Josh. I think we're just about out of time on the questions. I wanted to give the panelists kind of one last shot of what are your big picture thoughts? Whit, from a legal perspective, what do you see? Like, what are you thinking from a big picture?
Yeah, I think first, and it goes back to one of Elizabeth's early slides, but remember that these are important changes that are all set up to work together, right? You've got the rules for new sources, rules coming in place through state programs for existing sources, this waste emissions charge, and how they all tie together. It raises the stakes for the viability of any one piece. It's a puzzle, and if one piece is sidetracked and the others remain, it could really impact the effectiveness, of course, of this overall program that EPA is promulgating. I think it's understanding that perspective and how they're going to work together. The waste emissions charge, those dollars go up as far as the cost per ton or the charge per ton. But if you look at EPA's projections, they say that the revenue is going to be going down from that program because of compliance with the rules for existing sources and the like. But yeah, they're integral to one another, and it's so the program working as a whole. There's a lot at stake with these different rules surviving judicial review and or a change in presidential administrations. I think the second big picture thing, really tying into our theme here, is just how a lot of these changes highlight the importance of better information. Whether we're talking about your ability under the methane rule to deal with the super emitter program, potential third-party driven enforcement versus looking at the opportunities you might have to use more efficient, better measurement, and frankly the benefits you could get in the waste emissions charge with site-specific data versus default emission factors. These are all drivers for getting that better information and can really show a benefit to it that could impact the bottom line, not just being able to crow about reductions or better numbers in your SEC reports, but actually helping the bottom line with this waste emissions charge coming in. Those are my two big ones.
Thanks, Whit. That's super valuable. Jenna, Josh, Elizabeth, we've got about 1 minute, so I'm going to hold you. Whit took two. He did two big picture items. You get one. What's the most important thing our clients should be doing to set them up for success in their methane management programs? Jenna, I'll start with you.
Okay. Consider running a pilot project to understand the data you're collecting in your site and find a way to interpret, store, and then visualize the data.
Great. That's perfect. Like concise.
There
right?
you go. That's
15
it.
seconds. Elizabeth, yeah, you get your shot.
All right, I'm going to go philosophical, and I'm going to say to acknowledge that we are at a pivotal point in this industry and accept that with great challenge comes great opportunity, and to recognize that we're in a place where we're going to influence what the energy industry looks like moving forward, and to embrace it and take a minute to look at how everything comes together to influence your methane program and how you're going to build that program to let your business not only survive, but to grow through this and really be the face of the energy industry moving forward.
Love it. And Josh, 30 seconds.
Entrepreneurial spirit always wins. Roll up your sleeves, believe in yourself, and remember to celebrate the small wins, because those small wins add up to a really big opportunity, and ensuring that we're providing the best energy for the world.
Excellent. All right, everybody. We will wrap up. That's our roundtable portion of the webinar. To our attendees, thank you very much for giving us 1 hour of your time. Hopefully you learned a lot today about Montrose integrated methane management solutions, and we will get all of these slides will be available. And if you want to take it over, Jessica.
I just want to say thank you to the team at Montrose and to Whit at Bracewell. This was truly, and Sensible EDP. This was a really valuable conversation. It was enjoyable to listen to. I want to thank the audience for being so actively involved in today's discussion. There were truly a ton of questions that came in during today's event. So again, if your question was not answered, don't worry, because a member of the team will follow up with you, and please provide any feedback to us or to our presenters. And at this point, we're going to wrap up the webinar and hope to see you on with us soon. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.